O'Connor ruled Scotland's underworld with an iron fist, turning a small-time drug operation into a $1,160 million empire built on fear and loyalty. But in a world where trust is deadly, one betrayal from within shattered everything. This is the untold story of ambition, betrayal, and the fall of Scotland's most dangerous crime gang. In the shadows of Scotland's grimmiest neighborhoods, where poverty and despair were as common as the rain, a small group of young men found themselves caught in a desperate struggle to survive. Jobs were scarce, hope even scarcer, and the future looked bleak. For many, the only way out seemed to be through the streets, a world ruled not by law but by power, fear, and quick cash. It was here, amid crumbling tenements and dark alleyways, that Scotland's most dangerous crime gang was born. At first, they were just small-time dealers, selling whatever drugs they could get their hands on to make a few pounds. The operation was rough and risky, with little organization and constant threats from rival groups and the police. But these young men were clever and ruthless. They learned quickly, adapting to the dangers around them. What started as simple street sales soon became something far bigger. The streets whispered their names with a mix of fear and respect. The turning point came when they realized violence wasn't just a tool for survival, it was a weapon to build power. Rival dealers who crossed them disappeared, never to be seen again. Rumors spread about brutal beatings and warnings delivered in cold silence. This was no ordinary gang. They had a code, loyalty above all else, and zero tolerance for betrayal. The message was clear: cross them, and you would pay the ultimate price. Their leader emerged quietly at first, almost invisible, but behind the scenes he was the one pulling the strings. Unlike other gangsters who relied purely on muscle, he understood that to grow, they needed more than just fear, they needed control. He built connections with other gangs, negotiated secret deals, and even found ways to corrupt local officials. Slowly their operation became more than street sales. It was becoming a network, a business built on drugs, power, and intimidation. Money began to flood in, but with it came new challenges. They had to learn how to move large shipments without attracting attention, how to keep their members in line, and how to silence those who might betray them. The streets were no longer just a battlefield, they were a chessboard. Every move was calculated, every alliance carefully chosen. The gang grew smarter, more dangerous. What made this group truly terrifying was their ability to adapt. When police crackdowns happened, they found new ways to hide their activities. When rival gangs tried to push back, they struck harder. Their reputation spread quickly, and soon they controlled entire neighborhoods. No one outside dared to challenge them. People learned to keep quiet, to stay out of their way, or risk becoming collateral damage. Despite their rise, life inside the gang was far from glamorous. The constant threat of violence, the pressure to stay loyal, and the fear of betrayal created a tense atmosphere. Trust was scarce, and paranoia lingered, yet the promise of wealth and power kept the members committed. For them, the gang was family, a source of identity in a world that had otherwise ignored them. The journey from small-time dealers to Scotland's most feared gang was brutal and fast. What began in the back streets as a desperate scramble for survival soon turned into a sprawling empire fueled by violence and greed. Their story is a stark reminder of how quickly power can grow when combined with fear and ambition, and how dangerous the streets can be when ruled by those willing to do whatever it takes to rise. As the gang grew from a loose collection of street dealers into a more structured organization, a single figure began to rise above the rest, a leader unlike any Scotland had seen before. He wasn't just tough or violent, he was clever, calculating, and had a vision far beyond the usual chaos of the streets. While others relied solely on brute force, he understood that real power came from control, strategy, and influence. This man was the mastermind who would transform a ragtag group into a criminal empire. His background was unremarkable, a childhood spent in the same poor neighborhood as his peers, surrounded by hardship and few opportunities. But unlike many around him, he was sharp-minded and patient. He watched and learned, studying how gangs operated, where the weaknesses lay, and how to exploit them. Early on he realized that violence alone wouldn't be enough to hold power for long. The streets were unpredictable, and enemies multiplied. To survive, he needed something stronger: alliance. Secret meetings were held in hidden places, basements, abandoned buildings, even quiet pubs far from prying eyes. There he negotiated with rival gangs, sometimes offering peace, sometimes demanding cooperation. His deals were often sealed with threats or promises of shared profits, but always with a clear purpose: to expand influence and build a network no one could easily break. This strategy was risky, but it paid off. Slowly the gang's reach extended beyond their home turf into nearby cities and towns. One of his most dangerous moves was reaching out beyond the criminal underworld. Corruption was a tool he wielded skillfully, bribing police officers, local officials, and even business people to look the other way or provide information. These connections were hidden behind layers of secrecy, making the gang nearly untouchable. Law enforcement struggled to gather evidence as key players always seemed one step ahead, protected by those who had been bought off. With control over drug supply routes and protection from the law, the gang's business boomed. They diversified their operations, moving into new areas like weapons trafficking and money laundering. Cash flowed in steadily, and they began investing in legitimate businesses as fronts to hide their profit. The streets that once only knew fear now whispered about their influence in nightclubs, shipping yards, and even political circles. Their power was no longer confined to the shadows, it reached into the heart of the city. Despite the growing empire, the leader maintained strict control. He was known for his cold logic and ruthless discipline. Loyalty was demanded without question, and betrayal was met with swift punishment. This iron grip kept the gang united but also created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Members knew that stepping out of line could mean disappearance, or worse. Yet many stayed, drawn by the wealth and the protection the gang offered in a world where the law often failed them. His leadership style was a mix of strategy and intimidation. He rarely showed himself in public, preferring to pull strings from behind the scenes. Messages were delivered through trusted lieutenants, and orders executed with military precision. This secrecy made it nearly impossible for outsiders to understand the full scope of his operation or anticipate his next move. Under his guidance, the gang transformed from a street-level group into a powerful syndicate capable of controlling entire cities. The combination of brains and brutality created a perfect storm, one that few dared to challenge. Yet as with all empires built on crime and violence, cracks would soon begin to show. The very ambition that drove their rise also sowed the seeds of their downfall. With their leaders' careful planning and iron will, the gang's reach grew far beyond their original neighborhood. They weren't content to control just one corner of the city, they wanted it all. The ambition to expand was fueled by the steady flow of money and the growing reputation that had begun to spread like wildfire. It was no longer about survival, it was about domination. The gang's expansion started with smaller nearby towns. These places were often overlooked by bigger criminal groups, seen as unprofitable or too risky. But the gang saw opportunity where others saw danger. They sent trusted members to these towns, people they could rely on to enforce their authority and set up drug distribution networks. At first resistance came from local dealers who didn't want to lose their turf, but the gang's response was swift and brutal. Violence escalated, sending a clear message that no one could stand in their way. As they pushed further, the gang developed a more sophisticated system to manage their growing empire. Communication became more secretive and encrypted, using burner phones and coded messages to avoid police detection. Trusted lieutenants oversaw different regions, each responsible for managing shipments, collecting money and maintaining order. This structure allowed the gang to operate like a business, with different departments handling various tasks: logistics, security, finance, while the leader remained distant but in control. One of the key factors in their expansion was control over drug supply chain. The gang formed secret partnerships with suppliers outside Scotland, ensuring a steady flow of heroin, cocaine and other drugs. These shipments arrived through ports and hidden routes, guarded by loyal enforcers. With a reliable supply they could flood the markets in multiple cities, undercutting rivals and gaining loyal customers. This dominance in supply created a near monopoly that made the gang incredibly wealthy and powerful. The gang's influence didn't stop at drugs. They infiltrated nightclubs, bars and entertainment venues, places where drug sales could happen discreetly and profits were high. They invested in businesses that could serve as fronts for laundering money, using everything from car washes to real estate. This diversification helped hide their illegal earnings and gave the gang a sense of legitimacy in the eyes of some locals. As their empire grew, so did their political connections. Corruption became a crucial tool for maintaining power. Through carefully placed bribes and favors, they ensured that certain officials turned a blind eye or even helped shield their activities. This network of influence protected the gang from legal troubles and allowed them to operate with a dangerous level of impunity. Police investigations were often stalled or sabotaged, making the gang seem untouchable. But with great power came great risk. Expanding into new territories meant facing new enemies and more scrutiny. Rival gangs grew jealous and aggressive, leading to violent turf wars that spilled into public places, terrifying innocent civilians. The gang had to constantly defend its holdings, often with brutal reprisals that sent shockwaves through community. The leader's ability to delegate helped manage these conflicts, but cracks began to show. Some lieutenants grew ambitious, craving more power and control over their territories. Trust within the gang, once strong, started to weaken. Whispers of betrayal and secret alliances spread quietly but dangerously. Still, outwardly, the gang appeared as a unified force, a dark shadow cast over Scotland's cities. Their rapid rise was breathtaking but unstable. Behind the scenes, the tensions were mounting and the fragile web of alliances that held the empire together was under threat. Every city they conquered, every shipment they secured, brought them closer to a tipping point where ambition and greed might finally undo everything they had built. Violence wasn't just a part of the gang's operation, it was the foundation of their power. From the earliest days, the message was simple and terrifying: obey or face deadly consequence. Rival gangs, informants, and even innocent bystanders learned quickly that crossing this gang meant risking everything. Their reputation for brutality became legendary, spreading fear that kept enemies off balance and the public too scared to speak out. Murders were frequent and ruthless. Those who tried to challenge the gang's control were often disappeared without a trace. Bodies were found dumped in alleyways, burned out cars, or abandoned buildings, grim reminders of what happened to anyone who betrayed or defied them. The gang used these acts of violence strategically, making sure stories spread among both friends and foes. Fear was a weapon more powerful than any gun, and they wielded it expertly. Kidnappings and intimidation were common tactics as well. Rival dealers, suspected informants, and even witnesses were taken to secret locations where they were beaten or threatened into silence. Sometimes victims were released, broken and too scared to testify. Other times, they never came back. The gang maintained an invisible line between those who cooperated and those who didn't, but the penalty for crossing it was always clear. The violence wasn't limited to physical attacks. Arson became a tool for sending messages. Businesses and homes linked to rivals or uncooperative individuals were set on fire, sometimes destroying entire blocks. These acts of terror sowed chaos and made the gang's enemies question their safety and loyalty. It was a brutal form of psychological warfare that extended the gang's reach beyond the streets and into everyday life. Despite the chaos, the gang's leaders saw violence as a necessary means to an end. It kept their empire intact and ensured loyalty through fear. But it also attracted constant attention from law enforcement and the public. Police departments launched investigations, and journalists started piecing together the gang's violent trail. However, the gang's connections with corrupt officials often stalled these efforts, allowing the violence to continue unchecked for years. Inside the gang, the culture of violence created a tense and dangerous environment. Members were expected to prove their loyalty through acts of brutality. New recruits learned quickly that weakness wasn't tolerated. The gang's strict hierarchy demanded obedience, and those who showed hesitation risked being punished, or worse, eliminated. Paranoia was common. Trust was fragile because any sign of betrayal could lead to a deadly outcome. The violence also had a darker cost. Families of victims, innocent bystanders caught in crossfire, and whole communities lived under constant threat. The gang's reign turned neighborhoods into war zones, where fear controlled daily life. Schools, parks and public spaces lost their safety and people became prisoners in their own homes. The gang's power wasn't just about money, it was about control over every aspect of life in their territories. Yet for all its brutality, the violence was carefully managed. The leader understood that too much bloodshed could backfire, excessive violence risked drawing too much police attention or alienating potential allies, so loyalty through acts of brutality. New recruits learned quickly that weakness wasn't tolerated. The gang's strict hierarchy demanded obedience, and those who showed hesitation risked being punished, or worse, eliminated. Paranoia was common, trust was fragile because any sign of betrayal could lead to a deadly outcome. The violence also had a darker cost. Families of victims, innocent bystanders caught in crossfire, and whole communities lived under constant threat. The gang's reign turned neighborhoods into war zones, where fear controlled daily life. Schools, parks and public spaces lost their safety and people became prisoners in their own homes. The gang's power wasn't just about money, it was about control over every aspect of life in their territories. Yet for all its brutality, the violence was carefully managed. The leader understood that too much bloodshed could backfire. Excessive violence risked drawing too much police attention or alienating potential allies. So while the gang was ruthless, they were also strategic. Attacks were planned and timed to maximize impact while minimizing unwanted consequences. This delicate balance of fear and control held the empire together for a time, but violence, like fire, is hard to contain. It burns out of control and destroys everything in its path if not carefully managed. As the gang grew in power, so did the risks that their violent tactics would spark a chain reaction they couldn't stop. At the height of their power, the gang had built something few could have imagined, a drug empire worth an estimated $126 million. Their influence stretched across Scotland, with drug markets in multiple cities controlled almost entirely by their network. This wasn't just a street operation anymore, it was a sprawling business with complex logistics, money laundering schemes, and a reach that extended into the highest levels of the underworld. Their profits soared as the flow of heroin, cocaine and synthetic drugs grew. The gang had perfected the art of supply and demand, flooding markets with high-quality products while crushing competitors with intimidation or elimination. The sheer volume of drugs moving through their network was staggering, hundreds of kilograms crossing borders every month, hidden in shipments ranging from shipping containers to delivery vans. This scale allowed them to generate millions every week, much of it hidden in shadowy accounts and investments. The wealth brought luxuries unimaginable to many in the neighborhoods they came from. Gang leaders and their closest associates lived in sprawling mansions, drove expensive cars and flaunted their success in exclusive clubs and private parties. But beneath the surface, these displays of wealth masked a dangerous reality. Their power was built on addiction, violence, and fear, a fragile empire held together by ruthless ambition. Money laundering became a key part of their operation. Legitimate businesses were purchased or established as fronts to hide illegal earnings. Car washes, nightclubs, real estate investments, and even construction companies funneled dirty money back into the legal economy. This made it difficult for authorities to trace where the cash came from, and complicated any attempts to seize their assets. The gang's financial network was as sophisticated as any legal corporation. The empire wasn't just about making money, it was about control. With their cash flow, they could bribe officials, intimidate witnesses, and maintain a loyal force of enforcers. They controlled drug prices, dictated terms to suppliers and dealers, and maintained dominance over entire neighborhoods and cities. Their power extended beyond crime into political and social spheres, creating a shadow government of sorts that influenced decisions behind the scenes. At the center of this empire was the gang's leader, a man who combined cold calculation with charisma. He managed to keep the sprawling operation running smoothly, balancing the greed and ambitions of his lieutenants while maintaining order through a mix of rewards and ruthless punishment. His vision and leadership were key to holding together a group that could easily have torn itself apart under the weight of its own success. But this immense power came with risks. The larger the empire, the harder it was to keep secrets and maintain loyalty. Internal tensions simmered beneath the surface, fueled by jealousy and suspicion. The leader's control was absolute, but cracks began to appear as some members sought greater shares of the profits or questioned order. These internal struggles made the gang vulnerable, even as they appeared invincible from the outside. The gang's empire was a double-edged sword, a source of unmatched wealth and influence, but also a magnet for enemies, law enforcement and betrayal. Their success drew unwanted attention, sparking investigations and rivalries that would soon threaten to bring it all crashing down. The lavish lifestyle and massive fortune were only temporary shields against the consequences of their violent, illegal rise. Their story is a stark example of how power and money in the criminal world come at a high cost. For all the wealth they amassed, the empire was built on shaky ground, destined to fall when greed and mistrust finally overwhelmed even the strongest bond. At their peak, the gang seemed unstoppable, but every empire has its breaking point. At the peak of their power, the gang seemed invincible. Their vast empire brought wealth and respect, but beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that would eventually shatter everything they had built. Success had bred suspicion, jealousy and paranoia. In the dangerous world of organized crime, trust was the most fragile commodity, and once broken it was nearly impossible to rebuild. The leader had always maintained a tight grip on the gang, using fear and loyalty to keep members in line. But as the empire grew larger, his control became more difficult to enforce. His lieutenants, once loyal followers, began to see opportunities for themselves. The massive profits flowing through the organization tempted many to think they deserved more than their share. Secret meetings and whispered conversations hinted at alliances forming behind the leader's back. Jealousy was one of the first poisons to infect the gang. Some lieutenants believed they had done more to build the empire and wanted greater power and control over their territory. Rivalries flared quietly but intensely, with each faction vying for influence. This internal competition was dangerous. In the criminal underworld, any sign of weakness could be exploited by enemies or law enforcement. Paranoia spread like wildfire. The leader, once confident and commanding, grew suspicious of even his closest allies. He began demanding more loyalty tests, forcing members to prove their commitment through increasingly dangerous and violent tasks. This only deepened the mistrust within the gang. Many lived in constant fear that a wrong word or action would lead to betrayal or worse. The gang's code of silence, once strong, started to crack. Some members began questioning the leader's decisions, while others wondered if it was safer to cooperate with law enforcement to protect themselves. The threat of arrest or death loomed over everyone, making the stakes higher than ever. As pressure mounted, cracks widened into fractures. The leader's response was ruthless. He dealt harshly with even the smallest signs of disloyalty, ordering punishments that sent chilling messages throughout the gang. But these actions often backfired. Harsh reprisals fueled resentment and fear, pushing some members to consider betrayal as the only way out. The balance of power within the gang was shifting, and no one was safe. Meanwhile, the vast amounts of money flowing through the organization created temptation and conflict. Large sums were being siphoned off, hidden or stolen by greedy members. Disputes over money became common, fueling arguments and secret plots. The once unified gang was turning into a collection of rival factions, each protecting its own interests. This internal chaos weakened the gang's ability to operate effectively. Operations became disorganized, shipments delayed, and security lapses increased. Rival gangs and law enforcement noticed these vulnerabilities and began exploiting them. The gang's empire, built on years of careful planning and brutal enforcement, was beginning to unravel from within. Despite the growing danger, the leader remained determined to hold the gang together. He doubled down on control measures, hoping to crush dissent before it could spread. But in a world built on fear and violence, loyalty is never guaranteed. The very ambition and greed that had built their empire now threatened to destroy it. This period of tension was the calm before the storm. The gang's internal struggles set the stage for an unexpected betrayal that would shake the underworld and trigger a chain reaction no one could stop. The police crackdown set off a chain reaction inside the gang that would ultimately lead to its complete collapse. With leaders arrested and operations disrupted, the fragile balance that once held the group together shattered. What followed was chaos, distrust, and desperation, as the gang's remaining members scrambled to hold on to what little power they had left. The once tight-knit organization quickly turned into a battleground of suspicion. Members who had stayed loyal now questioned each other's motives. Fear of betrayal was everywhere. No one knew who might be cooperating with police or secretly plotting to take control. The paranoia was so intense that even longtime allies became enemies overnight. Friendships dissolved, and violence erupted from within. Some lieutenants seized the moment to assert their own power, trying to carve out new territories or control remaining drug routes. This led to brutal turf wars between factions of the same gang, each desperate to prove dominance and secure their survival. The violence was often reckless and public, drawing even more police attention and alienating the communities they once controlled. The leader's position became increasingly precarious. Isolated and hunted by police, his ability to command respect and loyalty weakened. His orders were questioned or ignored, and his control over the empire slipped through his fingers. Some insiders plotted against him, seeing an opportunity to take over or negotiate deals with law enforcement. The leader who once ruled with iron will was now vulnerable. Money, the gang's lifeblood, became a source of conflict. With shipments stopped and assets seized, funds ran low. Some members resorted to stealing from the gang's remaining coffers or selling drugs independently. This betrayal further fractured the group and deepened mistrust. The system that had once kept the empire running like clockwork was collapsing into chaos. As more members turned informant or cooperated with police, the gang's inner workings became exposed. Trials revealed the full extent of their operations. The drug shipments, violent crimes and corruption that had protected them. The gang's reputation as an untouchable force was destroyed, replaced by stories of betrayal and downfall. Public confidence in law enforcement rose, but the damage done to communities remained visible. The collapse was brutal and swift. Many members faced long prison sentences, while others disappeared, either killed or vanishing into hiding. The gang's infrastructure was dismantled, and what was once a sprawling empire shrank to nothing more than scattered remnants. Rival gangs moved quickly to fill the void, but none matched the power or reach of the fallen empire. For the neighborhoods that had lived under the gang's shadow, the collapse brought a mix of relief and uncertainty. Violence dropped in some areas, but new criminal groups and conflicts emerged. The deep social and economic problems that allowed the gang to rise in the first place were still there, waiting to be addressed. The fall of the gang was a victory, but it was far from the end of the story. The gang's downfall is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the destructive power of betrayal. It shows how even the most powerful criminal networks can be undone by internal conflict and law enforcement pressure. But it also highlights the human cost, the lives destroyed by addiction, violence and fear. As the dust settled, Scotland's underworld was forever changed. The empire that once ruled with terror and greed was gone, but its legacy remained, a reminder that in the dangerous game of organized crime, one wrong move can mean everything. The story of this gang is a stark warning, and a powerful example of how power, trust, and betrayal shape the fate of those who live by the law of the street. The story of Scotland's most dangerous organized crime gang is not just a tale of crime and violence. It's a complex narrative about power, ambition, loyalty and ultimately destruction. Their rise from small-time dealers in a gritty neighborhood to the architects of a $106 million drug empire shows how far determination and ruthlessness can take a group. But it also reveals the fragile nature of criminal empires built on fear and betrayal. In the end, the gang's downfall was as dramatic as its rise. Betrayal from within tore the empire apart, triggering a police crackdown that shattered their operations and destroyed the network they had spent years building. The leader's vision, once a source of strength, became a symbol of a fallen regime. Their empire, built on violence and greed, could not withstand the pressure of loyalty broken and law enforcement closing in. The legacy of this gang is felt in many ways. For law enforcement, it was a hard-fought victory that showed the power of persistence and intelligence gathering. Years of undercover work, surveillance and informant cooperation culminated in a series of arrests and convictions that dismantled one of Scotland's most notorious criminal organizations. It also exposed the complexity of fighting organized crime, where corruption and fear often protect those at the top. For the communities caught in the middle, the gang's reign was a period marked by fear and suffering. Their drug empire brought addiction, violence, and loss to neighborhoods that struggled with poverty and limited opportunities. The collapse of the gang did not immediately solve these problems, but it opened the door for healing and rebuilding. It also sparked conversations about how to address the root causes that allow such gangs to thrive. Issues like social inequality, lack of education, and economic hardship. The gang's story also serves as a warning. Power in the criminal underworld is fragile and often fleeting. Success breeds envy and betrayal, and even the most feared leaders can be undone by those closest to them. The gang's internal conflicts and the devastating impact of betrayal illustrate how trust and loyalty are both crucial and rare in this world. One wrong move can change everything. Beyond the headlines and police reports, the human cost is the most enduring part of this story. Families torn apart by violence, individuals lost to addiction, and communities living in the shadow of fear all remind us that behind the numbers and statistics are real lives affected deeply. The gang's empire was built on these human costs, a grim reminder of the price paid for power and money in the criminal world. As Scotland moves forward, the story of this gang remains a powerful lesson. It highlights the need for comprehensive strategies that combine law enforcement with community support, education and economic development. Breaking the cycle of organized crime requires more than arrests. It requires addressing the underlying issues that drive people into these dangerous paths. The empire that once seemed untouchable now lies in ruins, a testament to the rise and fall of one of Scotland's most feared crime gangs. Their story is a vivid example of how ambition and greed can build a kingdom on sand, destined to crumble under the weight of betrayal and justice. It reminds us all that in a world ruled by violence and secrecy, trust is the most valuable and vulnerable currency of all.